So day one at DefragCon has come to a close, and with that, a number of interesting sessions and interesting conversations came to pass. Beyond just the serverless concepts, which I'll talk about more in just a second, one of the key concepts that is actually, I think, part of the defrag concept, which was technology without sort of the marketing bent, but not just technology, sort of the entire space around technology, was really looking at the concept of diversity. And while the morning talk that was on diversity focused a little bit on diversity from the coding space, so not just thinking about coding engineering, but also thinking about some of the tools and systems that go along with that, like in this case it was developer marketing, and incorporating the community in that marketing space. The evening talk by Charles Ashley of Cultivating Coders was interesting because his talk on diversity wasn't about race or gender, but rather about resource location. He actually teaches a code school that focuses on rural areas. He actually works in rural New Mexico to help find new opportunities through the process of learning to code. And those opportunities aren't necessarily that they will go get coding jobs, but that it just enables a different way of thinking about things. It was a very powerful talk, and I thought a really interesting take on the concept of diversity. So really interesting conversations along those tracks. The other thing that came up, though, was really a number of people were talking about the serverless space and also the microservices space. A couple of people talking about the migration from classic applications, usually monolithic applications of some nature. One which was really interesting from the Gorilla Labs folks about taking an MVC, so a classic Ruby on Rails model for an MVC application, but taking that class of application and starting to try to break it out into microservices, looking at trying to define the sizing of those different service elements. What can I use for a data service? I need one. I was using the MySQL database that was part of the Rails model, and I needed to change that. I wanted to have a mail service as a part of my environment, and sort of using that as an internet-enabled service rather than code embedded in your application. Just sort of breaking those things out and looking at where the API boundaries can start to exist. One of the classic microservices architecture components, anyway, is the concept of understanding where those service boundaries can exist so that you don't ever have to reach across them. You can create APIs as the interface and only talk to the APIs from the other service components. So taking an application that's already working and migrating it over time into a microservices architecture, or as the speaker said, taking that in one shot and getting the big bang, which is not necessarily the big win bang, but like the application goes bang and it is now dead, trying to migrate to microservices as one shot. There was a big gap there, and his point was, maybe look at how you can start to divest pieces and make those pieces services while still keeping your core application running. And then over time, you'll find that your core application is just one of the microservices in your service chain. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation. The other microservices conversation was another one from a much larger application environment, a team that was taking an analytics-based application service and re-architecting it. It had become a monolithic app put together from a number of different coding components. And they started looking at how they could create a better streaming flow for their data, because they realized that they were sitting in a basically static big data service, but they really needed to go to streaming. And in that change, they suddenly started using more queuing technologies, which created a different API boundary. It was a queue-based boundary rather than a RESTful API-based boundary, and built little microservice components to fill out that entire pipeline. It was a major re-architecture. He was looking at it more from the perspective of the team and the development process for those interactions, looking at what scale your environment should be, how many teams you might have, doing different pieces of your application before it makes sense to really start breaking it down and saying, well, look, we need to build a set of different services. Those services internally may be using microservice architectures as well, but we need to have services with API boundaries that are static, that don't allow you to reach across from one application domain to another. That's a core microservices function again. So those were two really interesting conversations. And then there was the one serverless session that I thought was maybe the most interesting of the bunch. And that was a session on no ops ops. And his point was simply, we're talking about serverless servers, so why wouldn't we talk about not operating the operating components that need to exist? He was looking at a set of serverless applications. Basically, these were Amazon Lambda functions that they use and run as their application. Now, they have API gateways that provide events. They have a number of different messaging services that provide events into their Lambda environment to trigger the functions that run. One of the things that they ran into was that they had memory issues. Their Lambda functions kept needing more and more memory headroom. Basically, they started out with 100 gig headroom, and then they had to make it 200 gig, and then 300 gig and 400 gig, because they would get these weird crashes and lockups in their application otherwise. When they finally took the time to start operating their serverless environment in much the same way they would have been operating a server-based environment, starting to understand what the application is doing, how it's managing memory as the processes are running, managing file descriptors and a number of other components, realized that in reality, even though we're talking about serverless as this concept of here's my functional code, and when it is needed, when an event triggers it, that's when it starts and runs. The service providers don't actually build their infrastructure that way. When you start a Lambda function, if it gets used at all more than once, that Lambda function infrastructure, the extracted code that runs the function, and actually the service that sits around it, in most cases that's actually a container that sits around that Lambda function. In most cases, that container will run for some period of time. Now, if you're not getting a lot of triggers against that particular function, it might be that it only runs for 10 or 15 minutes. But if you're getting constant triggers against that function, and the function completes and before the next trigger, that one container may be the only one that gets spun up, and is actually then has a life cycle of a period of time. And in Amazon, the default is 4 hours for that particular life cycle for the underlying cold start of that function. It turns out that the cold start problem is one that the 4-hour life cycle is intended to help manage. If I'm getting constant requests, I have one cold start to get the container that's running your function to spin up, which happens fairly quickly, but is still slower than just triggering the function through the system. And so that's one of the things that happens. They were seeing memory issues. He showed a graph where basically the memory was sawtoothing up to the limit of the container, and or maybe not the limit of the container, it sawtoothed up to 400 meg of memory used until the 4-hour time window had timed out, and then it dropped down again. And then it would start to creep up again in a very linear fashion as that particular function kept getting hit, because they had a memory leak in their application. So really what this was pointing to was that even though the concept of serverless and function-based development is that, hey, I run my function, and when it's done running, once it's executed its process, it goes away, that's actually not true. And it is important to start actually monitoring the infrastructure of your serverless applications to understand how they're running. Are they running efficiently? Even though it's potentially much more cost effective, that doesn't mean that you still want to throw money away on a serverless style application just because you're not paying attention to what's going on. So really interesting talk. There was plenty more than that was covered, but those were sort of some of the key highlights from today. The only other thing I would say is that it was very interesting to learn that the 10th Defrag Conference is also the last Defrag Conference. The folks that put on Defrag Conference also put on GlueCon. GlueCon is a conference that actually looks mostly at API-driven services, so sort of there's a similar bent between these two conferences already. That wasn't intentional. It seems like that's just the way the speakers and the particular vendors that were coming to this conference started to mold this particular conversation. But GlueCon will actually take on some of the flavor of Defrag, and actually some of the folks that I've talked to have said that was already the case. The GlueCon conference already had a very Defrag-y-like nature, which makes sense. The same people put on both conferences. So in May, I think late May, is the next GlueCon, and I think it's really an interesting conference. I would recommend coming if you can in May of 2017. Anyway, this was the end of the day one review. I'll be doing some more live posts tomorrow. Please hop on and watch those if you get a chance. Thanks so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.